And so we too must act on behalf of justice. We too must act on behalf of peace. There are too many people who happily embrace Madiba's legacy of racial reconciliation, but passionately resist even modest reforms that would challenge chronic poverty and growing inequality. There are too many leaders who claim solidarity with Madiba's struggle for freedom, but do not tolerate dissent from their own people. And there are too many of us on the sidelines, comfortable in complacency or cynicism, when our voices must be heard. The questions we face today: how to promote equality and justice, how to uphold freedom and human rights, how to end conflict and sectarian war. These things do not have easy answers. But there were no easy answers in front of that child born in World War I. Nelson Mandela reminds us that it always seems impossible until it is done. South Africa shows that is true. South Africa shows we can change, that we can choose a world defined not by our differences, but by our common hopes. We can choose a world defined not by conflict, but by peace and justice and opportunity. We will never see the likes of Nelson Mandela again. But let me say to the young people of Africa and the young people around the world, you too can make his life work your own. Over 30 years ago, while still a student, I learned of Nelson Mandela and the struggles taking place in this beautiful land. And it stirred something in me. It woke me up to my responsibilities, to others and to myself. And it set me on an improbable journey that finds me here today. And while I will always fall short of Madiba's example, he makes me want to be a better man. He speaks to what's best inside us. After this great liberator is laid to rest, and when we've returned to our cities and villages and rejoined our daily routines, let us search for his strength. Let us search for his largeness of spirit somewhere inside of ourselves. And when the night grows dark, when injustice weighs heavy on our hearts, when our best laid plans seem beyond our reach, let us think of Madiba and the words that brought him comfort within the four walls of his cell. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged the punishment, the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. What a magnificent soul it was. We will miss him deeply. May God bless the memory of Nelson Mandela. May God bless the people of South Africa.
I just did one page, so you do the next page.
We'd like to thank President Barak Obama for his comforting words. We now move on with our program and acknowledge the presence of a number of other world leaders who have graced our land to come and pay tribute to Nelson Mandela. His Excellency President Silva of
well, let's just leave Cyril Ramaphosa there and just reflect for a moment on that speech from Barack Obama, which I think almost took on the form of a bit of a lecture to other leaders around the world, not just to talk about the principles of Madiba, but to live them as well and to exercise them in their judgments as politicians in charge of whichever countries they may be ruling at a given moment. It was a powerful speech that Obama delivered, and it was given something of a standing ovation there in the VIP area, including from George W. Bush, who also stood at the end of that speech, and you can see in the background there in the corner of the shots, as well as a number of the other dignitaries. But let's get a flavour of what atmosphere is like inside the stadium. We can cross now to my colleague George Alagaya. George.
John, thank you very much. Yes, people have been sitting here listening to that speech of Barack Obama with such attention. Of course, when he was introduced as a son of the African soil, that went down incredibly well. And whenever he's come to the continent, of course, people have tended to adopt Barack Obama. Well, listening to that speech, and we didn't get it all, it has to be said, the acoustics at the F&B Stadium here in Soweto aren't brilliant, but listening to it was Milton Nkosi, our correspondent here in Johannesburg. How important do you think it will have been to people here, but people watching the television around the country, around South Africa, to have Barack Obama, the President of the United States, here today?
It's been incredibly important, George. As you heard, we had a lot of speakers coming up before President Obama took to the podium, and there was not that much of a chair. And when he came up, there was huge applause for him, and people loved what he had to say. They enjoyed the bits when he was acknowledging other South African struggle heroes like the Sisulus, the Tambos, and all the others who struggled with Nelson Mandela. And they enjoyed when he mentioned the concept of South Africa called Ubuntu, the spirit of humanity, that I cannot be fully me until you are fully you. The idea that Barack Obama can fly all the way from America and talk about these pertinent issues that people talk about every day. This enthused the crowd even when the rain is still pelting down here.
And he seemed to sort of return to his old election refrain, the kind of yes we can, but except here he sort of said to the young people, not just of South Africa, but of the continent, he said, you too can strive for greatness.
Exactly, and the connection here was at the introduction. When he was introduced as our son, the son of Africa. That is the connection here. People feel great deal of affection for him and his wife, because Michelle Obama is here. We've seen her on the big screens as well.
You know, Milton, I know this is a memorial service for Nelson Mandela, remembering an extraordinary life, but I think we do have to mention the fact, and John's brought it up earlier in the programme, that when President Zuma is shown on these screens here in the stadium, he's booed. Now, let's not get into too much detail, but what is it that these people are booing about? I mean, we've got audiences obviously around the world.
What we had there is the politics of the African National Congress, the infighting that has been taking place. The governing party of South Africa, African National Congress. And it also speaks to the story that has been in the headlines here in South Africa about President Jacob Zuma being accused of taking 20
George Alagaya there. Well, let me bring in our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who was listening to that speech intently. Fascinating speech.
Fascinating, but also superb. I mean, he is a speech maker par excellence, but I've honestly never heard him give a better speech. That way that he brought in the people. He was on their side so much. He was using expressions that they would know here, specifically for them, expressions like Ubuntu, the wholeness of people. And I thought it was absolutely superb, I must say. And I loved the way that, knowing some of the leaders that are here, he said it isn't just enough to adore Mandela, also got to do what he said.
Yeah, and it was interesting because it looked like it was a speech that he'd come to make. Yes, it was a eulogy. Yes, it was in praise of. Yes, to talk about a remarkable life, a giant of history, he called him. But he also had that argument to make with the people who were there that, we've all got to learn to be better, and we've all got to sort of learn from the example of him.
And he himself, of course, said, I think twice, I want to be a better person along the lines of Nelson Mandela. It was personal to him, and it was personal to the leaders there, and it was personal, intended to be personal to the whole nation of South Africa. I think it'll go down extraordinarily well here.
And it's also interesting, isn't it, that you heard Obama talking about, I first learned about Mandela when I was a student. The political class of today have all grown up in the giant shadow cast by him.
And of course, they want to be seen as following, in some small way, the lead that Mandela has given them, because he has laid out a way for leaders of a country to behave to all the people of the country. I mean, one of the marvellous expressions, he comes up with these beautiful expressions. He's got some of the best speechwriters in the world, let's face it. But he said he freed not only the prisoners, but also the jailers. I've never heard it expressed so well. And he's talking to the whole of South Africa there, I think.
And the other point that he was making there, which again was all part of Mandela's experience when he was on Robben Island, was the idea that you understand your opponents. You try to read into the minds of your opponents so that you can understand them better. And that was the key, to his what happened and what unfolded in the talks that happened with the National Party, when eventually they got underway kind of towards the end of his time in prison.
Yes, I mean, I think the kind of revelation that Nelson Mandela achieved during his 27 years was to separate the individuals, the people, from the principles. And he realized that it was possible to talk to people without having to always to fight against them. And I think that was his key understanding, that thing that everything else went through. He didn't go into prison with that sort of understanding. He went in with quite a lot of bitterness, and the bitterness took some time to get rid of.
And reading his memoirs, you realise that actually he fought against that he fought against being consumed by bitterness, and when he came out, didn't want to talk about the privations that there had been when he was inside.
And they were unpleasant, no doubt about it. In those early years, other people, no, you're quite right. I mean, Mandela himself didn't dwell on it. Other people quite naturally wanted to get it out of their system. And there was a lot of really nasty treatment, harsh and cruel treatment in those, particularly in the early years, until somehow or another one of his great achievements was to win over his jailers, first of all, and then make the politicians realise that they'd got somebody of huge importance locked up in jail that they had to release.
And apparently, so the story goes, that even the most die-hard opponent of the ANC was won round to Mandela in the end during that time in prison. His jailers, he won them over with his charm. Well, let us go back inside the stadium now and to join my colleague George Alagaya, who's there for us.
Hello, I'm George